This story happened to me in 2010. Why am I telling it only now? The thing is, back then, I signed a non-disclosure agreement that kept me quiet for a long time. I couldn't speak, couldn't share even with the people closest to me. But now, special circumstances have arisen, and after all these years, I've decided to reveal the secret that's been gnawing at me all this time. You see, when you look at the happy faces of people living in their cozy, safe world, you want to shout at them that this world isn't what it seems. It's not as safe as we like to think. But then I'd wonder, was I just jealous? Jealous of their ignorance, their serenity, their certainty that absolute evil doesn't exist. Still, this story is for those who are ready to know the truth. At that time, I worked as an electrician for a contractor firm that serviced military installations across the country. These were secret bases, factories, and laboratories. The job, at first glance, seemed routine, not too difficult. Sure, it paid well, but the main factor was something else. You had to be able to keep your mouth shut. Silence was valued more than any skill. The company demanded complete confidentiality from its employees. The military didn't mess around either. You either followed the rules or you found another job. My work involved maintaining complex power systems at sites hidden from the public eye. These could be emergency generators that were never supposed to go offline or security systems powering electrified barbed wire fences. Sometimes I had to work in creepy underground tunnels that stretched deep into the earth, where no daylight reached. At that time, I was free, unmarried, with no obligations to anyone. My life was simple and low maintenance. I visited my parents when I could, but most of the time I was on the road. The company took advantage of that. They sent me on assignments across the country for 3 or 4 months at a time, sometimes for 6 months. One day, my boss called me in. From the look on his face, I knew right away that this conversation would be serious. He sat behind his desk, twirling a pen in his hands, not in a hurry to start. I walked in, greeted him, sat down across from him, and waited. The air was thick with tension, like he was carefully considering every word before saying it. "I've got a job for you," he finally said, looking up at me. "You're already used to traveling to secret sites, but this one's different. I recommended you." My mind started racing. What kind of place? Why different? But I kept quiet and listened. They pay well there, but there's one thing: secrecy and certain risks, so you need to think carefully about whether you want to go. "Where is it?" I asked, trying not to show too much curiosity. "Base 42, he said, lowering his voice slightly, as if even the walls could hear us. "It's in the Mojave Desert." He handed me a sheet with the conditions. I skimmed through it quickly and honestly didn't see any reason to say no. The pay was indeed good, and after all, I was already used to working at secret sites. This seemed like just another step up. I looked up and said, "I'm in." The boss nodded and immediately started making a few phone calls. Within minutes, I had an interview scheduled. It was my first one, and it took place in a regular gray office somewhere in Los Angeles. 2 serious-looking guys asked me questions, checked all my information, and conducted psychological tests. Obviously, they wanted to make sure I could handle stress and wouldn't break under pressure. I didn't know the results, but judging by how things went, everything seemed fine. A week later, I got another call. This time, I was summoned to a military base. There, I met with agents from the Federal Security Agency. They asked a ton of questions, but honestly, there's no point in going into detail. It was all routine. What really surprised me was how thorough the background checks were. I started to realize that the place I was being sent to was really top secret. Another week passed, and they called me again, inviting me back to the base. This time, they told me I was in, handed me a contract to sign, and gave me a special ID card with a chip for access to the base. Then they gave me just 1 day to pack. But truth be told, I didn't have much to pack, so I was ready to go by the next day. The next day, we were on a plane. There were a few other people with me, but no one said a word. The tense silence in the cabin felt like it was pressing on my ears. Everyone sat with stony faces, as if each of us knew something unusual was ahead. I sat quietly too, staring out the window. Soon we began to descend, and I saw the secret base. It looked exactly like I had imagined. Several massive hangars surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers with heavily armed soldiers. But it was clear that this was only the tip of the iceberg, with most of the base likely hidden deep underground. On the surface, there were only barracks, a command center, and a few garages for vehicles. When our plane finally landed, I was met by a man in his 40s. He introduced himself as Bob. Straightforward, no nonsense. A solid guy who had clearly been in the system for a long time. "You'll be working under me," he said. "If you have any questions, come straight to me. Don't go to others, and don't ask unnecessary questions." He said it casually, but with such seriousness that it was clear I shouldn't break the rules here. Then Bob took me to where I would be living. As we walked, I noticed armed men patrolling the area around one of the buildings. They were inspecting everything with such focus that it was obvious this place was being guarded at the highest level. That made me a little uneasy. Why such heavy security? What were they protecting so fiercely? I couldn't shake the feeling that the base was in a state of constant readiness, as if something serious could happen at any moment. We were in the heart of the desert, hundreds of miles from the nearest town. It was about 150, 200 miles to the closest settlement, if you could even call it that. Around us was nothing but endless, scorching emptiness. The sense of isolation gave me a slight unease, as if I was cut off from the world. With a growing sense of unease, I followed Bob until he led me to the barracks. These were enclosed living quarters with bars on the windows. At first, I didn't pay attention to the details, but when I realized that the bars weren't there to keep someone from escaping, but to keep outsiders from getting in, it gave me the chills. Why such tight security? What were they hiding here? That question gnawed at me. Once settled in my room, small but comfortable enough, I started adjusting to the new routine. As promised, Bob introduced me to the other guys, who, like me, were maintaining the base. We gathered in a small office not far from the living quarters. The people were generally normal, not asking too many questions. Everyone understood the rules of the game. Keep your mouth shut and do your job. I quickly got along with them, especially with a guy named Joe. Joe was a solid guy in his mid-30s, of average height, with short dark hair and a bit of stubble, as if shaving every day wasn't his thing. He was in charge of maintaining the life support systems, generators and air filtration. In this desert, where it was scorching hot during the day and freezing cold at night, such systems were a matter of survival. Joe and I hit it off quickly, as if we immediately understood each other. Joe was the kind of guy who never complained but could keep a conversation going on any topic, whether it was about work or something personal. Our days at the base were mostly uneventful. There wasn't much work on the surface, but something always came up. For example, a couple of times the lighting along the perimeter of the base went out. We had to fix the lamps, check the wiring. Occasionally, there were issues with the electrical grid in the barracks or command center. Minor inconveniences that had to be resolved quickly, but nothing major. So far, I hadn't been allowed inside the hangars, those giant metal monsters behind barbed wire. Bob said it was a matter of time, but my curiosity was eating at me. What was inside? But for the most part, I did my job and didn't ask questions. Free time followed a strict schedule, though there wasn't much of it. Mostly, the guys and I would gather in a small room we called the common room. There was an old pool table, and we often played a few rounds. Joe turned out to be a pool shark. He always managed to sink the last ball just when you thought you were about to win. A couple of times we got sucked into watching strange movies they played on an old TV. The base had its own closed broadcast system. No news, no channels, only what they chose to show us. So that's how my first few weeks at the base went. Fixing small breakdowns, talking with Joe and the other guys, playing pool, and the occasional venture beyond the barracks. Everything seemed almost routine, except for one thing: the constant feeling that something wasn't right. The problem started about a month in. I remember that day like it was yesterday. Something strange was brought to the base. A massive truck slowly rolled onto the premises, rumbling like a beast, followed by a security convoy. Armed men in helmets and body armor, as if preparing for war. On the truck was a massive container, and around it were people in protective suits. I didn't know what it was, but the presence of all this security and secrecy made my blood run cold. The truck quietly disappeared into the hangar, and the doors slammed shut with a metallic clang. And that was it. No information. From that moment on, security was increased even more. Armed patrols were swapped out almost every 2 hours. The base was buzzing with activity, though none of us who weren't allowed inside knew what was going on. Curiosity among the guys was at an all-time high. We were all speculating about what it could be. Some joked about aliens. Others said it was a new kind of weapon. But everyone understood. This was serious. A couple of days later, something happened that forever changed the atmosphere on the base. Joe was called to the main facility. Something had gone wrong with the ventilation system, and he needed to fix it. It was routine work for him, nothing special. He left as usual, energetic and confident. But when he came back, I didn't recognize him. Joe was pale as a ghost, his hands slightly trembling and his eyes. I'll never forget that look. They were empty, frightened, as if he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. I tried to talk to him, ask what had happened, but he clammed up. He wasn't the same Joe I played pool with. The energetic, cheerful man I once knew was gone. From that point on, he rarely left his room. We no longer saw him at the pool table, and he stopped talking to the rest of us. He only showed up to work when absolutely necessary, always looking like he was bracing for something terrible. No one knew what had happened to him, but everyone noticed the change. A week passed. One morning I didn't see Joe at breakfast, so I decided to ask Bob about him. Bob, as usual, was reserved and brief. "He transferred," he said curtly, as if it didn't matter. Transferred? I was surprised. Why? "Personal reasons," Bob replied, and quickly changed the subject. But that answer didn't sit well with me. Joe had just disappeared, without saying goodbye, without a word. Personal reasons? Or maybe the feds took him away for seeing something he wasn't supposed to see. All these questions swirled in my head, fueling both my curiosity and my fear. What could have scared Joe so much that he ran? Or was he forced to leave? After Joe's disappearance, life at the base seemed to return to its usual routine. But the conversations about what the military was hiding in those hangars didn't stop. The guys and I often talked about it while playing pool, but no one knew for sure. Everything was speculation and guesses. So when Bob called me in one day, I was already prepared for something serious. "Until Joe returns or we find a replacement, you'll take over his duties," he said dryly. "There's another issue with the ventilation in the hangar, probably something with the electrical system. This isn't the first time, so you need to fix it once and for all." I nodded, accepting the assignment. Bob handed me a pass that was clearly a higher clearance level than the one I had before. Now I had access to parts of the base that were previously off limits. "This is for the hangar," Bob said, handing me the pass. "Get it done quickly and without any unnecessary questions." I took the pass and headed toward the hangar. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. The hangar was like a fortress, a tall fence topped with barbed wire, armed soldiers patrolling the area. They stood by the gate, and when I approached, they stopped me, eyeing me warily. "Pass," one of them said curtly. I silently handed them the card, feeling their heavy stares on me. They looked at me as if deciding whether to let me through. After a moment of inspection, one of them silently returned the pass and gestured for me to go ahead. I passed through the gate, feeling their eyes on my back, as if they didn't want me there, but orders were orders. Inside the hangar, it was dark and hollow. The windows were covered with metal shutters, so only a few dim lamps hanging from the ceiling pushed back the darkness. The hangar itself resembled a massive warehouse, but without the usual chaos. Everything was neatly arranged, metal containers lined up in rows. There was a strange smell in the air, a mix of oil and something else I couldn't identify. In the far corner of the hangar, I spotted an elevator. It was an old model with metal doors and a control panel like something out of an old movie. When I approached it, the panel asked for my pass. I swiped the card, the doors hissed open, and I stepped inside. The elevator moved slowly, vibrating slightly, as if it was descending a great distance underground. I didn't know how much time passed, but when the doors finally opened, I was greeted by another soldier. He stood there motionless, like a robot, and carefully examined my pass, which I presented once again. "This way," he said curtly, gesturing for me to follow him. We walked down a short corridor, bright and sterile with metal walls. At the end of the corridor was a small room. Inside there was equipment, metal boxes, panels with gauges and screens that flickered constantly. It looked like a typical technical room, but there was something strange about its atmosphere, as if the air was heavy and thick. "This is the ventilation system," the soldier said, pointing to the equipment. "Do what you need to do." I inspected everything in front of me. The problem was clearly with the wiring. Some of the cables looked like they had melted, possibly from an overload or something else. I took out my tools and started working, checking connections and replacing damaged sections. This was routine work for me, but for some reason, this time, I felt different, like someone or something was watching my every move. As I worked on the repairs, thoughts of Joe and what he might have seen here kept swirling in my head. Soon I finished the job and made sure the ventilation system was working properly again. Everything was in its place. But when I looked around, the soldier who had brought me here was gone. He had disappeared without saying a word. And that's when I was hit by that stupid feeling. Curiosity. Damn curiosity. It always brings trouble, but I couldn't resist it then. I stepped into the corridor, glancing around, and kept walking. Ahead of me was another door, just like the others. I walked up to it and swiped my pass. With a soft hiss, the door opened, and I found myself in a large room. There was no one around. Maybe it was lunchtime, or the guard shift had changed. I didn't know and didn't give it much thought. In the center of the room was a large table, and my attention was immediately drawn to what was on it. On the table, something was covered with a tarp. A big, heavy piece of fabric concealed something of considerable size. I approached, looking around. No one came in, and the room remained empty. The silence was deafening. The closer I got to the table, the more intense my curiosity grew. What could be hidden under that tarp? My hand instinctively reached for it. I carefully lifted the edge of the tarp, and what I saw made my heart stop. In front of me lay a creature, the sight of which froze the blood in my veins. It was something between a wolf and a human, covered in dirty, gray, matted fur. But it wasn't an animal in the usual sense. Its limbs were long, with claws that looked as sharp as blades. The skin under the fur appeared withered, as if all the life had been drained from it. But it didn't look like a dead body. It seemed to be caught in some state between life and death. Its face, or what could be called a face, was disfigured, with a long snout and bared fangs, like a predator ready to tear its prey apart. I stood there, frozen, unable to believe my eyes. The creature lay motionless, but even in that state, it radiated an unimaginable terror. Its eyes, though closed, seemed to follow me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and the air in the room suddenly grew heavy, almost thick. I took a step back, feeling nausea creeping in. I nearly passed out from fear. What kind of creature was this? What were they hiding here? I stood there staring at the creature, but at some point I realized I had to pull myself together. I quickly lowered the tarp, trying to make it look as though I hadn't touched it at all. My heart was pounding like crazy, but I forced myself to move. I needed to get out of there, and fast, before anyone saw me. I stepped back into the corridor, looking around, but everything was quiet. It seemed no one had noticed my curiosity. Suddenly, a soldier appeared around the corner. He walked up to me, looking directly into my eyes. "Where were you?" he asked, his gaze heavy and suspicious. I tried to stay calm and replied, "Just looking around. Didn't go far." The soldier squinted, as if sensing something was off, but he didn't say anything. Then he asked, "Finished?" I nodded, though the image of that creature on the table was still spinning in my head. What the hell was that thing? But I couldn't afford to reveal myself. The soldier silently led me toward the exit, and I did my best to act like nothing had happened. But inside, I was completely shattered. By the time I got back to my barracks, I could barely stand. I sat down on my bed and just sat there, staring blankly at the wall. My mind was a mess. How was this possible? What had I just seen? How could I explain it? My brain refused to accept reality. For hours, I just tried to process it, but the fear and shock wouldn't let go. The creature, that thing, wouldn't leave my mind. It was clawing its way into my consciousness. The next day, unable to deal with the overwhelming thoughts, I went to see Bob. I couldn't stay on this base any longer. The thoughts of what else might be hidden here were tormenting me every minute. I needed to leave. Bob was sitting at his desk when I walked in. "Bob, I need a transfer," I said, feeling the tremor creeping into my voice. He looked up at me, his eyes full of doubt. "Something happen?" he asked, peering into my eyes as if trying to pry the truth out of me. "No, I want to transfer," I lied, knowing full well I couldn't reveal what had really happened. Bob stared at me for a long time, as if trying to figure out if I was lying or not. I did my best to keep it together, but his gaze felt like it was piercing right through me. "The next plane won't arrive for another month," he finally said. "You could drive out, but you'd need clearance for that, and it's not easy to get. So you'll have to wait." I had no choice but to agree. I nodded, though inside I felt crushed. Back in my room, I was devastated. I was trapped here. There was no way out, no way to escape the horror I had witnessed. The other guys, seeing my condition, tried to ask me what had happened, but I couldn't tell them. I just couldn't. The words stuck in my throat, and every time I thought about that moment when I lifted the tarp, a fresh wave of fear hit me. A few days passed, but I still couldn't pull myself together. The image of that creature wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I passed by the hangar, I had the feeling it would wake up and break free. I began avoiding the hangars, circling around them, even though everything seemed calm on the surface. No alarms were raised, and everything continued as usual. But inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The next day, a group of people arrived, escorted by the military. They were clearly scientists, wearing white lab coats, carrying folders and tablets. They looked concerned, arguing and discussing something among themselves. Their faces showed a mix of curiosity and worry. They disappeared into the underground facility, and as I watched them go, I had a bad feeling. Whatever they were doing down there, it couldn't lead to anything good. That evening I tried to sleep, but it wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, and the tension in the air was almost tangible. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by gunfire. Sharp, staccato shots that made my stomach sink. My heart began to race. The gunfire felt like a signal that something had gone terribly wrong. I jumped out of bed and quickly dressed, feeling panic rising inside me. I looked out the window and realized the power had gone out across the base. The gunfire continued, growing louder. Someone shouted, and then I heard screams. Screams of pain and terror. My heart stopped. I knew what had happened. That creature, the cursed thing I had seen under the tarp, had woken up. And from the sound of it, they couldn't stop it. I bolted for the door, ran into the hallway, and slammed it behind me. I bumped into a few others, their faces pale, eyes darting around in search of some explanation for what was happening. "What's going on?" one of them asked. "Quiet," I whispered, cutting off their frantic questions. "Hide, and don't make a sound." They looked at me in confusion, not understanding, but the gunfire and screams outside convinced them faster than my words. We all froze, listening. A thought crossed my mind that I needed to escape, get off the base, but that was almost impossible. The gunfire was too close, which meant the creature was nearby. I pressed myself against the window again, trying to see anything in the dark desert outside. But the gunfire stopped, and that was a bad sign. When the shooting stops, something bad is always about to happen. I strained my eyes trying to see something, but there was nothing but blackness, an endless void. Yet I could feel it. The creature was out there, somewhere. Then I heard a crash, a dull, heavy sound, like something massive hitting a metal door. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The creature was trying to break in, and from how loud it was, I knew it would break through without much effort. My heart pounded in my chest and I rushed back into my room, slamming and locking the door behind me, trying to stay quiet. My mind raced. What do I do now? How do I get out of here alive? In the corner of the room, I spotted the emergency exit, a small window designed for evacuation, covered by bars. In the event of a fire, the bars were supposed to open, but right now, it was my only hope. I waited, holding my breath, waiting for that thing to break through. And then the loud crash. It had knocked down the door. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze, listening. Had it entered, or was it still outside? The noise stopped, and a suffocating silence followed. I crept toward the door and pressed my ear against it, listening. Soft footsteps, slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I barely breathed, trying not to give myself away. It was right outside the door, slowly moving down the hallway. Then I heard a crash nearby. It had broken down the door to the next room. Inside there were screams of pure terror and agony, sharp and piercing, but short-lived. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I knew I had to get out. This was my only chance. I rushed to the small window, opened it, and began to crawl out, trying not to make a sound. The air outside was filled with the smell of dust and hot metal. As I slid outside, I glanced at the neighboring window, and that's when terror struck me. The creature was there. It was standing behind the glass, watching me. Its grotesque silhouette was barely visible in the darkness, but I clearly saw its eyes glinting in the moonlight. The creature was staring straight at me. And then it began pounding on the glass. Loud blows shook the wall. The glass cracked, and the bars bent under its strength. It was stronger than I could have imagined. I realized I didn't have time. I had to run. I knew this base like the back of my hand, so without hesitation I sprinted toward the exit. Past the buildings, past the hangars, past the dead lights and the ringing silence. My heart pounded like crazy, and fear pushed me forward, as if the creature was already breathing down my neck. At the exit, there were vehicles parked, and I jumped into one, hoping for a miracle, but there were no keys in the ignition. This only happens in movies, I thought bitterly. No miracles here. Not waiting for the worst, I climbed out of the car and headed for the gates. To my surprise, they were open. Someone must have escaped before everything went to hell. The guard towers were empty, no guards in sight, or maybe they were hiding. I didn't stop to think. I darted down the road, running faster than I had ever run in my life. Fear drove me forward. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what might be behind me. After running for a while, I finally felt my strength leaving me. I glanced back. The desert. I was alone. It seemed like I had managed to escape. But this was only the beginning. The nearest town was about 200 miles away, and I knew the journey ahead would be long. I began conserving my energy, walking along the road, hoping someone would appear. I walked all night. My legs were giving out, and my head swam with exhaustion. At some point, I just collapsed onto the side of the road and passed out. I woke up to someone shaking me. I opened my eyes and saw it was the military. Their faces showed a mix of caution and confusion. "What happened?" one of them asked, kneeling beside me. "Water," I whispered, barely able to speak. They gave me a bottle and I drank it greedily. When my mind cleared a bit, I told them everything that had happened on the base. They exchanged glances, but there wasn't much surprise on their faces. Only tense, focused looks. "Come with us," one of them said. "You'll be safe." I refused immediately. Go back there? After what I had seen? No way. but they assured me that reinforcements were already on site and that the base was under control. I was skeptical, but I agreed. When we returned to the base, the scene was horrific. The base looked like it had been torn apart by a hurricane. Soldiers were swarming everywhere, searching for something, going through the buildings. They were carrying bodies through the main gates, wrapped in black bags. There were too many of them, far too many. So many that a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I found out that Bob, my supervisor, was among the dead. But the scariest part, the creature I had seen was gone. No traces, not the slightest clue. It had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. They took me to a tent where they questioned me in detail about what had happened. After that, they asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. At that moment, I knew I had no choice. I signed it. That chapter came to an end, and after some time, they allowed me to return home. Many years have passed since then, and now I can finally tell this story. But I know that somewhere out there, in the Mojave Desert, that creature still lurks. It's still alive, and it shatters everything we think we know about the world. As the relentless sun scorched the vast, seemingly boundless Syrian desert, I, Captain John Hawkins, stood steadfastly by the colossal HEMTT truck. My gaze was fixed on the meticulous loading of vital communication equipment. The air was filled with the gruff shouts of the loaders, a cacophony that underscored the significance of our task. Each crate, especially the large one that was the centerpiece of our cargo, was handled with a reverence that bordered on the religious. This crate, sealed tightly and peppered with mysterious holes, piqued my curiosity, but protocol and the stern looks from the overseeing government officials kept my questions at bay. Among these officials, several individuals in nondescript civilian attire stood out. They kept their eyes hawk-like on the cargo, particularly the enigmatic large crate, suggesting its contents were of extraordinary value. Our mission was deceptively simple yet of paramount importance. Transport this cargo from the ancient storied city of Palmyra to Deir ez-Zor, a journey that, under normal circumstances, would take about 8 hours along the M20 highway. However, these were not normal circumstances. The route cut straight through the heart of the Syrian desert, a land infamous for its unforgiving heat, sudden and blinding sandstorms, and the ever-present threat of ambushes by local bandits. It was a land that tested the mettle of even the most seasoned travelers. Thus, our squad of 10, bolstered by the presence of 5 government officials, was tasked with ensuring the safe passage of this mysterious cargo. Our preparations had been thorough. Each member of the team was a seasoned veteran, handpicked for their expertise and experience in such high-risk operations. The air was thick with tension, a silent acknowledgement of the dangers that lay ahead. The final piece of equipment was secured with a resounding click, signaling the end of our preparations and the beginning of our perilous journey. I made my way to my designated vehicle, the heart of our convoy. The truck was an imposing beast, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. Inside, I was joined by Lieutenant Smith, a man of few words but unshakable composure, and Mr. Jefferson, a tall, enigmatic figure from the government whose age seemed hard to place. He carried himself with an air of authority that demanded respect. Our convoy was a formidable sight. Leading and trailing were 2 heavily armored MRAPs, their mounted machine guns casting ominous shadows. Our truck, carrying the precious cargo, was sandwiched securely in the middle. Flanking us were a couple of sleek SUVs, their tinted windows hiding the government officials who were as much a mystery as the cargo we were transporting. The journey began with the slow, lumbering movement of our convoy out of the private courtyard where the loading had taken place. We passed an old Arab stone house, its architecture a testament to the region's rich history. Its high, narrow windows overlooked an inner courtyard where a once vibrant fountain now lay silent, a mute witness to the passage of time and the stories it carried. The local children, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe, clustered along the road. Their excited chatter and pointing fingers a brief, heartening distraction from the weight of our mission. As we left the confines of civilization, the terrain shifted. The road became a mere dirt track, a precursor to the vast open desert that lay ahead. The landscape around us was a tapestry of extremes, endless dunes that rose and fell like the waves of a petrified ocean, their golden hues ever changing with the sun's position. Here and there, hardy shrubs clung to life, their existence a defiant stand against the harsh, arid climate. The air was thick and hot, a tangible presence that seemed to press against us with an almost physical weight. The sky was a relentless expanse of blue, unmarred by clouds, its vastness a reminder of our insignificance in the face of nature's grandeur. The silence of the desert was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the loading area. It was a silence that spoke volumes, filled with the whispers of ancient sands and the secrets they held. In this desolate expanse, the sun was a merciless overseer, its rays beating down upon us with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to the very core. The heat was more than just a physical sensation. It was an ever-present force, an adversary we had to contend with every moment. The shimmering heat haze on the horizon danced and distorted the landscape, creating mirages that toyed with our senses. Our convoy trudged along, a metallic beast crawling through the ancient sands. Inside the truck, the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio were the only sounds that pierced the overwhelming silence. The atmosphere was one of solemn anticipation, each of us lost in our own thoughts, mentally preparing for the journey ahead. I glanced at Mr. Jefferson, who sat stoically, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His demeanor was an enigma, calm yet unreadable, adding another layer of mystery to our mission. Lieutenant Smith, ever the professional, kept his focus on the road, his hands steady on the wheel despite the rough terrain. As we approached the M20 highway, the landscape began to change subtly. The endless dunes gave way to flatter, more navigable terrain, though the oppressive heat and the blinding brightness of the sun remained constant companions. The highway itself, a lifeline cutting through the desert, stretched out before us, a ribbon of tarmac that represented both our path forward and the challenges that lay ahead. I broke the silence, my voice sounding strangely loud in the confines of the truck. "Mr. Jefferson, this cargo we're transporting, can you tell us anything about it?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. He turned his gaze to me, his eyes revealing nothing. "It's just equipment, Captain. Nothing for you to worry about," he replied, his voice even and unemotional. I nodded, though his response did little to quell my curiosity. Beside me, Lieutenant Smith opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. He turned his attention back to the road, a silent acknowledgement that some questions were better left unasked. As we merged onto the highway, our speed increased, the convoy settling into a steady rhythm. The landscape blurred past us, a monotonous blend of sand and sky. As the relentless sun bore down upon us, our convoy, a line of dust-covered vehicles, wound its way through the Syrian desert. The silence inside the truck was as dense as the heat outside. Only the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio broke the monotonous drone. I sat deep in thought, my gaze occasionally drifting to the barren, sun-bleached landscape that stretched endlessly on either side of the highway. A fleeting glimpse of a desert fox, a rare sight in these arid lands, momentarily captured our attention as it darted across the road. Its russet fur was a stark contrast against the pale sands, a fleeting moment of life in an otherwise lifeless expanse. It was in this moment that Mr. Jefferson chose to speak. "Captain, how long have you served in Syria?" he asked, his voice smooth yet carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "Nearly a year, sir," I replied, maintaining a professional demeanor. He nodded thoughtfully before delving into a topic seemingly unrelated to our current task. "You must have had extensive contact with the locals. Have you ever heard about the wild asses that once roamed here?" he inquired. His question caught me off guard. "No, sir, I haven't. My focus has been elsewhere," I responded, slightly puzzled by the sudden shift in conversation. Clearly, the Syrian wild ass, Equus hemionus hemippus, a subspecies of the wild ass, once inhabited the Middle East. Smaller and more resilient than its counterparts, adapted to the arid desert conditions, it struggled to survive. Yet, despite its efforts, it became extinct, succumbed to hunting and habitat loss. Humans are cold and merciless, and in the war against them one must either hide from them or adapt to become useful, to not interfere. This is the path to survival. The Arabs have a legend. In the endless deserts of the Middle East, caravans whispered legends of a ghoul named Zahira. She was a night creature, a twisted echo of her former human self. Zahira lived in the ruins of ancient cities, luring unsuspecting travelers with the guise of a young, seductive woman. Those who succumbed to her charms ended up in her lair, never to return. It is said Zahira was once a princess who fell victim to a curse for her pride and cruelty. Transformed into a ghoul, she roamed battlefields and graveyards, feeding on the dead. She could transform into various forms, often appearing as a hyena or reverting to human form to deceive her prey. The only way to defeat Zahira was with a single decisive weapon strike. A second strike would revive her. I listened, intrigued yet wary. "An interesting story," I finally said, trying to gauge his intention behind sharing such a tale. Mr. Jefferson's response was a thin smile. "Imagine if the wild asses had adapted like Zahira. Would they have met the same fate? Adaptation, Captain, is the key to survival. And perhaps it's not just the domain of rats and cockroaches," he mused, his smile widening just a fraction. The conversation dwindled, leaving me to ponder his words. I reflexively checked my pistol, a habit ingrained from years of service. His talk of mythical creatures and the parallels he drew with our mission left me unsettled. I felt a sudden dryness in my throat and reached for my water flask, unscrewing the cap and taking a long sip. But then, a sound from behind, a distinct thud, made me choke on the water, coughing as I hastily turned around. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all I saw was the dusty road and the convoy trailing us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. Lieutenant Smith, our driver, gave a brief nod, his expression tense. Mr. Jefferson, however, remained calm, almost unnervingly so. After a brief silence, he simply said, "Pay it no mind." His nonchalance did little to ease my growing sense of unease. What were we carrying in this convoy that warranted such secrecy and protection? Before I could probe further, the unexpected happened. The vehicle ahead came to a sudden, grinding halt, sending a jolt through our truck as we braked hard. Without hesitation, I grabbed my rifle and exited the truck. My eyes scanned the surroundings, the stark, unyielding desert offering no clues. The heat was a palpable force, waves of it distorting the air and blending the horizon into a mirage. The road, once a symbol of connection and progress, now resembled a war-torn landscape, riddled with deep craters and littered with debris. Massive chunks of asphalt lay scattered like the remnants of some forgotten battle, a stark reminder of the conflict that had ravaged this land. My eyes surveyed the destruction, a knot of apprehension tightening in my gut. Lieutenant Harris, leading the convoy in the first vehicle, approached me with a grave expression that mirrored my concern. "Captain, this route is impassable," he stated, pointing to the ravaged highway. "Our best option is to detour through the desert and loop back to the road further on." His voice carried the weight of experience, one honed in the crucible of countless missions. The desert, though seemingly empty, was fraught with hidden dangers. Mines could be buried beneath the innocent-looking sands, and the occasional scrubby bushes provided ideal cover for insurgents. I scanned the horizon, the vast expanse of sand stretching out in every direction, feeling the weight of the decision upon me. It was then that Meister Jefferson, the enigmatic government official who had been a constant presence of mystery, joined our discussion. His gaze lingered on the devastated road before us. "We need to move quickly, Captain," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "We don't have the luxury of time. Take the detour." His words brooked no argument, and I could sense an underlying importance in his tone that went beyond our immediate predicament. Reluctantly, I issued the order. A scout vehicle moved ahead, cautiously navigating the treacherous off-road terrain while we maintained a safe distance. The journey was jarring. The vehicle shook violently as it traversed the uneven desert. Amidst the tumultuous ride, the mysterious thumping from the cargo area returned, more insistent than before. I cast a questioning glance at Mr. Jefferson, frustration edging my voice. "What in God's name are we carrying?" His response was curt, delivered with a commanding authority that brooked no further inquiry. "Ignore it, Captain. That's an order." His words echoed in my mind as we continued our journey. The soldiers around me shared looks of unease, each man battling his own thoughts and fears. Eventually, we navigated the rough terrain and rejoined the highway. The soldiers' tension was palpable, eyes constantly roving, hands gripping their weapons a little tighter. The gunner swiveled ceaselessly, vigilant against any potential threat. Despite the ever-present danger, we encountered no further obstacles and accelerated along the highway. The road ahead stretched into the distance, flanked by small cliffs and mountains that heralded a more dangerous terrain. The looming canyons were notorious for their treacherous turns and hidden crevices, perfect for ambushes. As we entered a narrow canyon, the towering rock walls closed in around us, their imposing presence casting long, dark shadows across our path. The canyon was a stark, rugged beauty, its walls a tapestry of reds, oranges, and browns, carved by the relentless forces of nature over millennia. The narrow path wound its way through the towering cliffs, the silence of the desert amplified by the enclosing rocks. Here, in this ancient corridor carved by wind and time, we were acutely aware of our vulnerability. Small shrubs and hardy plants clung to life in the crevices, their stubborn existence a testament to the harshness of this environment. We proceeded with heightened caution, the convoy tightly knit as we navigated the serpentine path. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The soldiers were tense, their training and instincts on high alert. The atmosphere was charged, each of us braced for the unseen and the unexpected. It was about 5 minutes into the canyon when my gaze fell upon something unsettling. A kufiya, its red and white fabric barely visible against the rocky backdrop. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I grasped the full implication of what I was seeing. Danger was imminent. I reached for the radio to alert the others, but my actions were too slow. From behind a large boulder, a figure appeared, brandishing a rocket launcher, the unmistakable silhouette of a Soviet-made Igla anti-tank system. Time seemed to slow as I watched him launch the missile, its trail zigzagging through the air towards us. I yelled a warning, but it was lost in the cacophony of the ensuing explosion. The world erupted in chaos. The force of the blast sent shockwaves through the convoy, and our vehicle, caught in the maelstrom, was violently tossed. I could hear the screeching of metal, the shattering of glass, and the shouts of my men, all melding into a symphony of destruction. The impact was like a hammer blow, throwing me against the interior of the truck. My head spun, and my vision blurred, the line between consciousness and darkness wavering precariously. As consciousness slowly seeped back into my mind, I found myself being dragged across the rugged terrain of the Syrian desert. The ground beneath me was a patchwork of coarse sand and sharp rocks, scraping against my skin with every jolt. My ears rang with the cacophony of gunfire and desperate shouts, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had preceded the ambush. When my vision finally cleared, I saw my squad members in defensive positions, their faces etched with determination and fear. They were firing towards distant shadows, figures obscured by the haze of the desert heat. We were on a slight incline, a vantage point about a mile away from the smoldering remains of our convoy. The scene was one of utter devastation. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and rubber. Scattered around the wreckage were our assailants, easily distinguishable in their eclectic mix of traditional Arabic clothing and military gear. It was apparent that we had been overwhelmed by their numbers, forcing us to retreat to this precarious position. They were systematically firing in our direction while simultaneously scavenging through the remnants of our cargo. Amongst the chaos, I noticed several of them attempting to force open the largest crate, the primary focus of our mission. With effort, I managed to get to my feet and grabbed my rifle, joining my squad in the firefight. I took aim at the figures surrounding the crate, my heart pounding as I squeezed the trigger. I managed to hit one, watching as his comrades hastily dragged him to cover, but they did not cease their efforts to open the crate. Mr. Jefferson, who until now had been an enigmatic presence, was actively firing beside me. Amidst the chaos, he yelled out, emphasizing the importance of preventing the crate from being opened. We concentrated our firepower, but our efforts were in vain. The assailants had managed to pry the crate half open, and what followed seemed like a nightmare come to life. The crate's door suddenly burst outward from the inside, hitting one of the attackers with such force that he was thrown several feet into the air. From within, a creature emerged. It was massive, resembling a grotesquely mutated dog, its movements a blur of deadly precision. It tore through the attackers with a ferocious rage that was chilling to witness. The beast's killing spree was brutal and swift. It lunged at one man, biting off his limb in a spray of blood. Another assailant was disemboweled within seconds, his insides spilling onto the desert sand. The air was filled with the sickening sounds of flesh being torn and bones being crushed. As the creature wreaked havoc, the attackers' focus shifted from us to the new threat. Their screams of terror mingled with the sound of gunfire as they desperately tried to fend off the beast. The scene before us was one of pure carnage, the ground quickly turning into a gruesome tableau soaked in blood. In the midst of this horror, panic set in among the bandits, and they began to flee. The creature pursued them relentlessly, its fury unrelenting. Mr. Jefferson's voice cut through our shock, urging us to move. I nodded, snapping out of my dazed state, and quickly assessed our situation. A roll call revealed the heart-wrenching cost of the ambush. Corporal Smith, always the one to lighten the mood, and Senior Lieutenant Avertley, the embodiment of stoicism, were both gone. Their absence created a void that was felt deeply by every member of our squad. Additionally, one of the government officials had been killed. Our numbers were now reduced to 8, including 2 wounded and 4 remaining government agents. I radioed for backup, receiving confirmation that help would arrive in 6 hours. Our immediate priority was to distance ourselves from the chaos and the unknown horror we had unleashed. The only remaining vehicle, an MRAP, had been rendered inoperable during our retreat. We salvaged what we could: stretchers for the wounded, essential equipment, ammunition, and most importantly, water. In the unforgiving desert, water was as valuable as life itself. The realization that we needed to evacuate immediately was unanimous. The creature, a living embodiment of terror, posed a threat we were ill-equipped to handle. It was a force of nature, unpredictable and deadly. As we prepared to leave, the gravity of our situation weighed heavily on us. The burning vehicles behind us were a grim reminder of the day's events, a testament to the chaos we had narrowly escaped. Yet, there was no time for mourning or reflection. Survival was our only objective. I activated the GPS beacon to ensure that rescuers could locate us. With the wounded securely on the stretchers, we began our arduous journey. The desert stretched out before us, vast and unyielding, its beauty marred by the violence that had just unfolded. After trekking approximately 10 grueling miles through the rugged canyon, our weary group finally emerged onto the open desert. We trudged alongside the highway, a desolate stretch where no vehicles dared to travel. The heat was oppressive, its intensity unrelenting, as we took turns carrying our wounded comrades, our strength waning with every step. As dusk began to blanket the sky, we were on the verge of setting up camp when a flicker of lights in the distance caught our attention. In the heart of the desert stood a solitary structure. Drawing closer, we found ourselves before an old, yet beautifully crafted, Arab stone house. It was a 2-story building with a small courtyard in front, and the doors stood invitingly open, illuminated by the warm glow of lights inside. I recognized it as a typical Syrian tavern, a haven for travelers braving the desert's harshness. The house featured a central courtyard enclosed by high walls, offering a secluded sanctuary. A fountain adorned its center, surrounded by lush greenery, a serene oasis amidst the sweltering desert. We cautiously entered the courtyard, where I noticed a bell next to the door. Ringing it, we were soon greeted by the house's owner. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a well-groomed beard and dark hair, slightly tinged with gray. His skin was weathered from the Syrian sun, giving him a rugged yet wise appearance. Dressed in traditional garb, a flowing robe and a taqiyya, he exuded a welcoming aura. He introduced himself as Muhammad. We explained our need for a room, water, and clean bandages to tend to our wounded. Muhammad's gaze swept over us, pausing briefly on the government officials. Then he nodded and soon returned with the requested items. We tended to the wounds, thankfully minor, and Muhammad then offered us a meal. The food was simple but nourishing. Unleavened bread, olives, laban, a thick sour milk believed to have healing properties, and Arab sandwiches, flatbreads filled with finely chopped onion, parsley, and bits of meat. We ate gratefully and thanked our host. He nodded in response and showed us to our rooms. The government officials took one room, while our squad divided among the remaining 2.
Soon, a peaceful quiet settled over the house. After everyone else had drifted off to sleep, I told Lieutenant Smith, who was on watch, that I wanted to explore the surroundings. Stepping outside into the cool night air, I felt a refreshing change from the day's blistering heat. The sky was a tapestry of stars, offering a moment of tranquility. I decided to walk around the house. As I rounded a corner, I stumbled upon a small grove of trees with a well at its center. Curious, I approached the well and peered inside. It was too dark to see the bottom, so I pulled out my flashlight and shined it down. To my horror, at the bottom lay a body that had clearly been there for some time. But what chilled me to the bone was the realization that the corpse belonged to Muhammad, the tavern owner I had just met. Gripping my rifle tightly, I rushed back to the rooms. Checking on my squad first, I found nothing amiss. However, upon entering the government official's room, I was met with a shocking scene. Muhammad stood in the center, staring at one of the officials who was pointing a gun at him. As I entered, Muhammad turned his head slightly towards me, then began to shake violently. His body contorted in unnatural ways, bones cracking and reshaping under his skin. The sight was both fascinating and horrifying. First, his face elongated, the jaw stretching forward, the skin rippling and contorting as if something underneath was struggling to break free. His eyes, once warm and inviting, now glowed with a feral yellow light, deep and wild. His mouth widened, lips tearing at the seams to accommodate the growing, sharp teeth that emerged, dripping with saliva. The transformation was not just confined to his face. His limbs lengthened and thickened, muscles bulging and expanding in a grotesque display of power. His fingers elongated into claws, tearing through the fabric of his traditional robe. The sound of his clothing ripping was drowned out by the guttural growls emanating from his throat. His spine arched unnaturally as coarse, dark fur sprouted all over his body, covering him in a thick, animalistic pelt. The once stooped figure of a middle-aged man was now replaced by a hulking, beastly form, towering over everyone in the room. As the transformation completed, the creature that stood before us was a terrifying sight to behold. A werewolf, a mythical being of strength and primal fury. It snarled, revealing a row of razor-sharp teeth, its eyes scanning the room with predatory hunger. The man we had known as Muhammad was gone, replaced by this monstrous entity, a creature of nightmares come to life. The official opened fire, and I quickly ducked for cover, so you don't get caught in the crossfire. The creature, now monstrous in form, lunged at one of the officials, biting deep into his throat. The others continued to fire, but their bullets seemed to have little effect. In a panic, they fled the room, leaping over me in their haste, except for one. The monster grabbed his leg, tearing into him with ferocious bites. Frozen in shock, I watched the gruesome scene unfold before regaining my senses and opening fire. Hearing the shots, the rest of my squad rushed in and joined the fray. The beast, agile and seemingly impervious to our bullets, leaped across the walls before smashing through a window and escaping into the night. Silence fell over the house, a haunting stillness that lingered long after the creature's departure. We inspected the victims of the attack, but unfortunately, they had succumbed to their injuries. Fear was evident in the eyes of every member of my squad as we looked around. We decided to barricade ourselves in a room until help arrived. According to the schedule, it should have been soon. I checked the GPS tracker. It was working perfectly. I sighed, overwhelmed by the day's shocking developments. While my subordinates were setting up inside, I decided to survey the surroundings, taking Lieutenant Smith with me. We left the house, scanning the area, aware that the creature could be lurking anywhere. The darkness was on its side. We circled the fountain and were heading towards the exit when a person emerged from around the corner of the fence. We quickly raised our weapons. It was Mr. Jefferson. He sighed with relief upon seeing us and approached. We kept our guns aimed at him, instructing him to raise his hands. Initially surprised, he then understood the situation and complied. I asked him to state his name, and he responded. Then I asked him to say my name. His answer was correct, but we weren't sure if the creature couldn't mimic memories. Mr. Jefferson then approached us, claiming he was indeed himself. I grabbed him by the collar and demanded to know what was happening. Up to this point, I had been silent and hadn't asked him about the creature since we were in a hurry to leave the area, but now he needed to explain. He gently freed himself from my grip and, sighing, began his story. They had received a message that locals had found a strange place, something like a tomb or burial site. When they arrived, they found this creature. It was something unreal, supernatural, belonging to no known species. It lay still as if dead, but upon taking samples, they realized it was still alive. They theorized that this creature might be the very ghoul from Arabian legends. The project was quickly classified, and they set up a camp near Palmyra to study it. They conducted experiments on it, trying to understand its nature. They did everything with it, but the creature had incredible regenerative abilities. This intrigued them even more, but then they began to notice signs of the creature awakening. A finger twitched, and when one of the workers saw this, he panicked, understandably, as we ourselves had seen how terrifying the monster was. Soon, when they continued their experiments, the creature opened one eye, surveyed each of them, and then closed it again. In shock, they realized it was time to transport the creature to a more secure and fortified location. Unfortunately, the area where the camp was located was in a no-fly zone due to terrorists controlling the airspace, making it dangerous to move by air. So they decided to transport it to Deir ez-Zor and from there to our military base. It was decided to attract as little attention as possible and transport it with a small squad, but apparently, someone leaked information about the cargo, though they did not know what we were transporting. As he finished his story, everything fell into place. The puzzle was complete. I began to process what had happened and let my guard down. I didn't notice when someone approached us. It was the last of Mr. Jefferson's surviving colleagues. His face was frightened, and he looked around nervously. Mr. Jefferson, relieved to see him alive, said, "I'm glad you're alive, Jake," and went to pat his shoulder when Jake suddenly swung his hand, and Mr. Jefferson's head rolled onto the floor. I screamed and, raising my rifle, started shooting at the creature. Lieutenant Smith joined in, but the creature, having transformed back into the monster, swiftly jumped to the side and disappeared into the bushes. We kept firing as other soldiers came running out, but we ceased fire. Standing in the darkness, with only the dim light from the lamps illuminating the small courtyard, we were tense, scanning our surroundings. Suddenly, the creature leaped out of the bushes from the other side, flying towards me. Lieutenant Smith, fortunately reacting in time, hit the creature's side with his rifle butt. It saved me. The creature only managed to scratch me. A thin stream of blood trickled down my cheek. The creature flipped in midair and landed skillfully on its hind legs. It then looked at us and was about to attack again when the roar of a helicopter sounded in the sky, and the lights of vehicles approached the inn. Backup had finally arrived. The creature noticed this and roared in frustration, then jumped, grabbed Mr. Jefferson's body, and disappeared into the night. We continued to shoot, but to no avail. We stood in shock, trying to digest what had happened. The realization came to me. This creature wanted to avenge those who had awakened it and experimented on it. Now it had vanished into the night, and we would likely never find it again.